Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank you for participating. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today's webinar is based on TCRP Synthesis 143, Managing the Transit Scheduling Workforce. We are pleased to have as our presenters today, Michael Walk and Peter Hadley. Michael J. Walk is a research scientist at Texas A&M Transportation Institute's, that's TTI's, Transit Mobility Program. Michael has 11 years of management and executive experience in public transit and over 13 years of experience conducting research, leading projects, and training. He's the program manager of TTI's Transit Mobility Program and leads a group of 9 other researchers conducting local, state, and national research on transit and shared mobility. Michael specializes in transit planning, operations, and scheduling, transit performance management and measurement, transit regulatory compliance, data collection, and analysis. Customer and community, I was stopping like the sentence ended. Customer and community outreach, and applying innovation and technology to transportation challenges. Peter Hadley is a transportation planner whose work at Foursquare ITP has included bus rapid transit corridor studies, transit network redesigns, long-range planning, and flexible transit models. He has 8 years of experience working in public transit, real estate consulting, that's one term, and urban redevelopment. Today's session will consist of the presentation of the material with a question and answer at the end. Because the attendees can't speak to us, they can ask their question rather in the Q&A box. If you don't see the Q&A box, you can enable it on the Zoom controls, which are most likely on the bottom of your screen. It should say Q&A. You can type your question in, and we will hold on to it until we break for Q&A, and then I will moderate the questions to our presenters. If you haven't already printed out a copy of the presentation that was emailed to you, this morning at some point, there is a link pasted in the chat box. You might have to scroll up to see it. I can repeatedly paste that in there throughout. I think that should be about it for all the housekeeping details. And it's time for the presentation. So Michael, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lori. Just want to confirm that my audio is coming through. Yes?
I hear you perfectly. I'm hoping
Great.
Everyone else does too.
Yeah, if not, let us know.
Yes.
Welcome everybody. My name is Michael Walk. I'm with TTI, or Texas A&M Transportation Institute. And as Lori mentioned, I'm joined today by Peter Hadley from Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. And we're here to talk to you about TCRP Synthesis Report 143, which is titled Managing the Transit Scheduling Workforce. Excuse me. Our agenda for today is to first talk a little bit about why the research is important on transit schedulers and why this particular synthesis report is germane right now. We'll talk briefly about the research method, then highlight our key findings, and we'll go over the case studies, just present a few little snippets from the case studies. We want to feature for you the resources that are available in the report so you know what's all there, and then talk a little bit about future research needs. And then at the end of the session, we should have about a half an hour or so available for Q&A. So first, we wanted to talk about why this research on managing transit schedulers matters. And although we might be preaching to the choir, given who might be attending this webinar today, we thought it was important to reiterate just why transit schedulers are so important. And when we're talking about transit schedulers, we're talking about individuals who create fixed route transit schedules. So, they're building trips and blocks, runs, and rosters for fixed route transit. And these schedulers are so critical because they provide that blueprint for all fixed route transit. Without a schedule, fixed route transit doesn't operate. But the schedule that's produced by schedulers influences so many aspects of the transit system, operating at capital cost, the safety of the service, how satisfied customers are, and how satisfied and healthy your operators are. If operators don't have enough time to take a break at the end of a trip or use the restroom or are overly stressed to maintaining a non-reasonable timetable, right, that impacts operator well-being and health. So the schedule impacts so much of day-to-day operations, and that's why it's important that schedulers are equipped to do the best job possible. The data that's in a schedule also has downstream implications for intelligent transportation systems, customer information systems, etc. So if you produce GTFS or general transit feed specification data that's consumed by Google Maps or other apps, if you have real-time passenger information systems, if you have websites that have schedules on them, if you have printed timetables, all of those downstream systems and printable collateral all rely on a good schedule. And of course, scheduling is a complex activity. Anyone who runs a scheduling department or has done scheduling knows just how complicated and how many details there are that have to be worked out, that have to be checked to make sure there's no errors or mistakes when it comes to creating the schedule. And even though there's software that's available for schedulers, the scheduling software is a tool, to help automate some processes, but scheduling by and large is still a manual activity that requires humans to make decisions. And the analogy we make here is that, just because someone is good at software doesn't make them good at their job. So being good at Excel is not the same as being a good accountant, right? They're not equivalent. Excel is a tool that accountants tend to use, and it makes their job easier, but it certainly doesn't replace the accounting skills that are required to be a good accountant. If you're good at Word, it doesn't make you automatically a good author or a good writer. And so, Word is a tool that writers can use in order to make their job easier and automate some parts of it. But, being good at Word is not equivalent to being a good author. And so the same is true for schedulers. Knowing how to use the scheduling software, what buttons to click, and does not equate to being a good or an expert scheduler, although it's a tool that's available. So software is not replacing schedulers. Schedulers still need to be qualified in order to do their job. There's a lot that's been changing in the scheduling world over time. What used to be a largely paper-driven process, is largely driven by software now. Data collection that used to be manual in terms of ride-alongs or point checks and just trying to get a few snippets of data in order to make decisions now is being done automatically with AVL, Automated Vehicle Location Systems, or APC systems, which stands for Automated Passenger Counters. All these systems are collecting data automatically. There's so much data available to schedulers now. And of course, the data analysis itself used to be a largely manual process where you had to create maybe a special spreadsheet or even do something on paper, but now is largely done automatically. Data sources and can come with in-house reporting systems. And so all these things are changing in the scheduling environment. So it's critical that transit agencies look hard at their management practices for schedulers, because how well you manage schedulers, how well you recruit them, select the best ones, train them, and retain them, and manage performance over time will impact scheduling outcomes. You need to have the right people in there doing the right job the right way in order to have the best possible schedule, and the schedule is so important to the day-to-day operation and to operating costs that this research is really important, we think, at this time. The research method was straightforward. We conducted a literature review. We surveyed 43 North American transit agencies. We conducted 5 case studies, and then all that information was compiled into the synthesis report number 143. This being a synthesis report, our job is to synthesize what we found out in the North American industry in transit, and to just share some key findings. There's a lot more in the report, but our goal today is just to highlight for you the basic overview of the findings. So we've grouped the key findings into these 8 categories: data use, staffing and organizational alignments, and then we'll look at recruitment, selection, training, retention, performance management, and then working with third parties. So first, a little bit about data use and scheduling. We asked survey respondents, how they use data in scheduling and what sources of data are used. The most common source of data were customer and operator feedback. So even though it might be quantitative or qualitative, scheduling departments that responded to our survey were using this by and large. Virtually all of them had some mechanism to collect customer or operator feedback to influence the scheduling process. In terms of automatic data systems, CAD-AVL and APC systems were often used, particularly for establishing running times and as well as headways, required headways. Schedulers were often responsible for actually performing data analysis themselves, not just having an analysis handed to them, but actually doing the data analysis themselves and taking an action based on that data analysis. So, completing a running time analysis using perhaps CAD-AVL data, and then making edits or revising the schedule in order to reflect the information gleaned from that CAD-AVL data. Now, the use of software was almost ubiquitous at every agency, regardless of size. At least Microsoft Excel was being used by virtually all the respondents. But most agencies, had a custom-made scheduling software package like Castus, Trapeze, etc. And many agencies were using additional software packages for additional analyses, so using ArcGIS or using Microsoft Access, etc., to run other reports. So this leads to and supports the idea that schedulers need to be computer savvy and able to work with different software systems. We also took a look at how scheduling departments were organized and staffed. And so first was, where do scheduling departments tend to sit inside a transit agency organizational chart? Scheduling departments usually were in the third or fourth organizational level, with the CEO being level 1, so just thinking down 3 or 4 from that level in the organization. And scheduling departments were usually located in a planning or operations type division inside the organization. The number of schedulers varied from agency to agency and usually was a function of how big the agency was. We tried to approximate that looking at the number of vehicles per scheduler. And so you can see the average number of vehicles per scheduler was 74. That varied widely across agency types. So like a large urban agency with a lot of service had a higher number of vehicles per scheduler. So you see the typical large urban agency coming in at about 141 vehicles per scheduler. We did find that many transit agencies had multiple scheduler job classifications. So, maybe an entry-level or mid-level and upper-level position. This gives a sense of upward mobility and increasing responsibility for schedulers. We also asked about starting wages and for new hired schedulers. And you can see there's a difference in the median starting wages depending on agency type. Again, more details available in the report about the wage data. We did find interesting that we asked transit agencies if their schedulers were also planners, if they performed a planning role. We found 42% of the responding agencies had what we call planner/schedulers. That is, the person did both jobs. They were both a planner and a scheduler. Whether it was an even split or not, we don't know, but we know that the person was responsible for doing both things. And we found that schedules were often required to interface with staff, most of the time internal, but sometimes, less often, however, with the public. Transit agencies required that their schedulers actually talked with members of the public and got feedback from them. Now, in terms of recruitment, selection, etc., we asked about transit agencies' practices. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key features of managing this human capital. So one is that transit agencies tended to recruit both internal and external, having a slight propensity towards internal candidates, usually from the operators or operations managers. Transit agencies reported that internal job boards or newsletters were the most effective recruiting tool for those internal candidates, but also said that industry periodicals, so think Mass Transit Magazine or Transit Talent or something, were also effective at recruiting new schedulers. In terms of the educational requirements for new hires in the scheduling ranks, a high school diploma or GED was the most common educational minimum qualification. However, undergraduate degrees were commonly preferred. And then in terms of skill requirements, the most common requirements were Excel, written and verbal communication, as well as word abilities. Although on a preferred note, transit scheduling and software knowledge, so being knowledgeable of scheduling was of course preferred for new hires, but was usually not a requirement for new hires because it's a tough skill to get on the street. When selecting schedulers, transit agencies reported that in-person interviews were the most frequently and most effective method at selecting the right scheduler, usually using structured interviews so that every candidate's asked basically the same question set. Now, of course, what the right questions are is always up for debate. We found a couple examples of internship or apprenticeship type programs where entry-level people were brought in, and, given some responsibility, and then ultimately, hopefully, recruited to be a full-time scheduler. These programs were deemed effective by the agencies that used them, but they just weren't frequently used. And a few agencies did use tests, like a standardized test, perhaps to measure computer skills or other types of candidate characteristics, but they were not frequently used. The agencies that did use them found them effective, but by and large, when we talk to agencies and inside our case studies as well, there's really no good standardized test that's available across agencies to select schedulers. The next step, of course, after recruitment and selection is training. And so we looked at both new hire training and ongoing training. In the most case, we saw the new hire training was performed one-on-one by experienced schedulers. That was by and large the most typical modality. And that training could last a month or more, often 4 to 6 months. It focused on several key foundational topics like the transit system design, how to set running times and build trips. Agencies reported, how long they thought it took a new hire to become fully competent, and the answer was 2 or more years. So you can see it's a significant investment in your staff in order to become a fully competent scheduler. Scheduling departments did have ongoing training programs when they could. The existing manuals that are available, published both by TCRP, TCRP Reports 30 and 135, appeared to be underutilized, not well used by the responding agencies. And although some agencies had internal training programs that they were trying to put in place, most were not well standardized or well documented, so that the training was, in effect, done every time ad hoc. Hopefully everything was covered, but there was, in terms of a formal training program, there were not a lot of examples. Only a few agencies included a type of data analysis training for new hired schedulers. And most agencies reported that training was difficult just simply due to the lack of time and resources, and the focus is getting the next schedule change out, and it's hard to dedicate time to actually build capacity among the new hires or even current schedulers. In terms of strategies for retention, how do you keep the schedulers you have with your company after you spend all this time in training and getting them up to speed? The reality was most agencies that we asked did not have specific retention strategies, weren't setting aside particular initiatives to try to improve scheduler retention. Some strategies that were reported to us included making sure that schedulers were in line for regular wage increases or tying wage increases to performance, providing ongoing training to schedulers as a way to get professional development and continually increase responsibility, and just taking steps to improve the working environment, making sure that schedulers had a positive working environment, keeping the stress level at a reasonable amount, and involving schedulers in activities and things in the department. Lastly, in terms of managing scheduler performance, this is how do you take a scheduler and make sure that they're doing a good job over time. Transit agencies reported, sometimes tracking and documenting scheduler mistakes for individual schedulers, so you could watch that progress over time and make sure you had a record of things that went wrong or mistakes that were made. Transit agencies often sought feedback from users like bus operators, like street supervisors, in order to have a feedback loop to make sure that the schedules that were created were good, were reasonable, streetable schedules. You could also measure this quantitatively in terms of looking at the costs built into the schedule or the vehicle requirements or operator requirements, watching these metrics over time to make sure that schedules were as efficient as possible and were in line with past schedules. In terms of sharing work, this was an interesting difference among several agencies. Many agencies shared work among all schedulers. So if you had 4 or 5 schedulers, the schedulers would do different things, do trip building for garage A and then later do blocking for garage B. And while that worked in some cases, some agencies also took a different approach in assigning specific work to individuals or teams so that for instance, a particular bus garage was completely the responsibility of a lead and then 1 or 2 schedulers underneath them, so that that group was responsible from soup to nuts for trip building all the way up through run cutting and rostering. And so that was seen as highly effective way to manage the performance of those individuals. In terms of taking corrective action when there are problems with the schedule or things aren't going quite according to plan, documenting performance issues was said to be very important, and providing ongoing counseling and continual training was seen as the most common way to deal with corrective action as opposed to disciplinary activities, but just really trying to build the schedulers up to capacity and full competency. Most transit agencies did not use third parties or outsourced scheduling. However, if they were used, these third parties were mostly used to perform run cutting or activities or rostering activities. Transit agencies that did use third parties reported they needed to review those schedules, of course, make sure that the quality was high and that the performance measures like pay-to-platform ratios or peak vehicle requirements were all within reason. And those agencies that did use third parties found it beneficial, particularly when the service provider, which your contracted operator, was also your third-party scheduler, so that the quality of the service on the street, was under the complete ownership of that one company. Both had to operate the service and schedule the service well, and that appeared to be an effective method if you do have a contracted operation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Peter. He's going to talk a little bit about the case study highlights.
We interviewed for this report representatives from 5 different transit agencies across the country. They're listed here. As you can see, they represent agencies of varying size and geography across the country, and as a result, we think they provide kind of a useful cross-section of industry practice. It's worth noting that these are, I'm just going to highlight a few of the best practices that we uncovered in our interviews, best practices, lessons learned, and some of the challenges that these agencies identified. But there are more included in the actual report, so be sure to check that out. So firstly, we interviewed Lanta, which operates in the Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton corridor in eastern Pennsylvania. It was interesting that Lanta told us in their interview that in their opinion, a transit scheduler typically needs about 5 years of experience before he or she reaches full competency in creating high-quality transit schedules. So as a result, scheduler retention becomes extremely critical. And it was interesting to hear that in their experience, retaining schedulers was not always a monetary issue, and that their schedulers at Lanta feel kind of a personal connection to the agency and the service area. They take a lot of pride in their work, and so that's kind of key in scheduler retention. And that kind of speaks to the supportive work environment that plays in scheduler retention and making sure that schedulers feel a part of the mission of an agency. Lanta also highlighted the possibility of creating standardized resources for selecting and training qualified schedulers, and perhaps even the adoption of some industry-wide certification programs. Next, we spoke with representatives from SEPTA, which of course operates out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. One interesting lesson that we learned from them was that someone on staff there developed a macro-enabled Excel workbook, which kind of cleaned and analyzed APC data in the background before it ever landed on a scheduler's desk. And this, of course, removed some of the burden of the data manipulation and analysis from the scheduler so that they could focus on actually using the data to make better schedules. It also, of course, reduced the opportunity for certain types of human error and just generally made the schedule creation process more efficient. However, SEPTA SEPTA noted that the tool was a bit of a double-edged sword in that, on the one hand, it automated a very time-intensive process of kind of cleaning and manipulating the data and getting it in the right stage to actually analyze. But on the other hand, SEPTA noted that this automation could potentially reduce a scheduler's comprehension and understanding of what the data actually means, or how to do more in-depth analysis if it were needed. Secondly, they placed a significant emphasis on training their newly hired schedules, which is kind of a theme that we heard from a lot of the case study agencies, was that investing in current or newly hired schedulers was extremely important for retention, and then of course staff advancement and development. SEPTA has created a task-based instructional document for new hires, which describes the step-by-step process of creating their schedules, which many of their schedulers found very helpful when they were learning on the job. And they've also worked with some of their recently hired schedules to document the concepts and skills that they learn as they become introduced to the industry that kind of go behind some of the work, with the goal of creating a skill training document for both new and existing schedulers. Next, we spoke with OCTA out of Orange County, California. They noted how difficult, of course, it can be to recruit senior level schedulers who have some work experience on the job. It's just difficult to recruit and attract candidates who have experience as schedulers to kind of change jobs, change market areas, a new system, and new processes. It's something that schedulers are generally loath to do. And as a result, they placed an emphasis on investing in their entry-level schedulers through professional development. And that took the form of an annual staff training for the specialized software that they use there. And also they set aside budget money for attending conferences and other professional development opportunities. They also noted that although they are currently unable to do so at this time, that perhaps covering the relocation costs might make it easier to recruit out-of-town qualified candidates who have scheduling experience. Next, we spoke with DART out of Des Moines, Iowa, and they were interesting insofar as they were the only case study agency that worked with a third party to assist in creating schedules, especially around their major service changes. They, of course, emphasized that the process of creating schedules is complex enough even when you're doing it entirely in-house, and when you introduce an outside third party, it makes it that much more complex. Therefore, communication with the outside group is extremely important, and they specifically noted that version control of certain documents is a significant challenge, and something that, if you're going to approach a third party to help with scheduling, to really make sure you've got a strong process in place. They also had a very robust probationary period for their newly hired schedulers, where they're subject to a 2 to 3 month probationary period, in which senior schedulers closely review newly hired schedulers and their work products, so that mistakes are caught early on and on-the-job training is provided. DART also told us that creating a collaborative work environment was key in their eyes in making transit schedulers feel less isolated in their work. And they did this, or they tried to do this, by encouraging collaboration between schedulers, and then also between schedulers and planners, and other aspects of operations like operators and customers. And this not only leads to a more fulfilling work environment for schedulers and therefore employee retention, it also leads to a better work product. Schedulers are able to see how their work impacts the success or failure of the transit system, and this tended to create in their eyes a sense of ownership or personal connection with the service that the customers and operators see every day. So it's something that they really place an emphasis on. And lastly, we spoke to RTD out of Denver, Colorado. Michael mentioned that about 40% of the agencies that we surveyed had schedulers who also acted in some capacity as planners, and it was somewhat unique that an agency of RTD's size actually adopted this organizational structure. So their schedulers were also responsible for certain short-range planning tasks, and they identified that on the one hand, that it gave schedulers greater contextual awareness around when service changes are made, and this in turn resulted in better schedules. But it also required schedulers to work with both qualitative and quantitative data sources, which RTD saw as a strength. But at the same time, it also, of course, means that staff just generally spends less time actually creating schedules, and therefore, their time is split between planning work and schedule creation. So that is something that needs to be taken into account. And furthermore, finding candidates who have the necessary skills to become good schedulers is difficult enough. Just finding somebody with knowledge of how to do the job well, but it can be even more difficult identifying candidates with the skills necessary to do both scheduling and planning work. RTD also divides the responsibility of their planner schedulers and their workload into geographic regions, which are shown here. Schedulers take ownership of the entire process of the schedule creation from start to finish within a given zone. RTD told us that this promotes accountability within the agency. So when a particular schedule or area is not performing particularly well, it is easier to identify the problem and take steps to correct it. And then kind of going back to the difficulty of recruiting candidates with both skills in planning and scheduling, RTD pointed to RTD has created a relatively robust internship program, which has been in existence since the 1980s, and they're very proud of. It's aimed at recruiting undergraduate students, and during the internship program, interns learn skills in data analysis and software proficiency, which allows them to hit the ground running if they are eventually hired as schedulers. Something that they are very proud of, and as a result, nearly half of the current staff has actually started out as interns, which is pretty remarkable. So stepping back, we wanted to highlight a few consistent themes that we heard from many of the agencies that we interviewed for these case studies. And first and foremost, something we've talked a lot about, but selecting and recruiting qualified candidates is just really hard. Scheduling is a complex process which requires a very unique and diverse set of skills. It's not enough just to be very good at the software or to know how to do data analysis in Excel or to be very familiar in transit operations. It's an entire portfolio of skills that's required to succeed as a scheduler. And knowing this ahead of time during the hiring process, who will succeed as a scheduler and who will enjoy the work is a major challenge that all of these agencies acknowledged. Also, many of the agencies noted how important it is, of course, to invest in new hires and in existing staff so that schedulers feel fulfilled in their work and retention doesn't become a problem. And as we've noted before, it also leads to better schedules and as a result, just a better transit system. So stepping away from the case studies, we also wanted to point out some of the resources that are available in the report that you should be sure to download and check out. First and foremost, there's a more detailed analysis of the survey results from all of the 43 transit agencies that responded to our survey. You can kind of dig into some of those results. There are job description examples, which include minimum job qualifications and preferred job qualifications of some of the agencies that we interviewed, so you can kind of get a sense for what some of your peer agencies are looking for, at least what they publish when they are trying to recruit qualified candidates. There's also an example of an operator complaint form that one of our agencies uses to incorporate vehicle operator feedback into the schedule creation process in order to improve the product. There is a proofing checklist that one of our agencies uses to QA/QC their work, which practitioners might find interesting to see how other agencies approach that process. And finally, there are many organizational charts which include job classifications and job titles so that practitioners can understand how some of their peers structure their scheduling departments. And finally, while this report identified some interesting lessons learned and best practices, it also uncovered a few areas for future research. So for example, there remains some room for improvement and standardization around how transit agencies recruit and hire qualified candidates. Of course, once you select them, how do you train them? We identified the fact that there is this tendency for transit agencies to focus on teaching newly hired schedulers how to use the software side of the scheduling process, rather than some of the concepts and data analysis that underpin some of the work. And of course, this is obviously due to the time and resource constraints that many agencies face. So the emphasis is just teach them how to use the software so that they can immediately hit the ground and start creating and proofing schedules. So it would be interesting to know more about how teaching scheduling concepts and data analysis early on in the process increases a scheduler's upward mobility and satisfaction. Is there value in teaching these concepts, especially early on? And if there is, how is that value manifested? And this kind of goes back to the metaphor that Michael mentioned earlier about the accountant who knows how to use Excel or QuickBooks really well, but doesn't understand the basic principles of accounting. So there's some interesting areas to probe there. This, of course, in turn highlighted the need for additional and more widely used training manuals across the industry, some standardization there, and some just additional resources for this process, which, of course, is not, we also identified the fact that many of these resources may not be appropriate for some of the smaller or more rural transit agencies, so who may need more resources specifically tailored. So for example, these agencies may benefit from off-the-shelf resources for the schedule creation process, or even language that would aid in the procurement of specialized scheduling software. And next, what are some of the best practices in using data in the schedule creation process? We tried to identify to a certain extent what types of data and at what point they're used in the process, but there's certainly more work to be done here, especially as data availability and accuracy has improved over the years and will continue to do so. So there are certainly new best practices that have been developed that would be very beneficial to identify and kind of more systematically outline. And some of these include using percentiles and distributions instead of averages in your data analysis, or more efficient screening and cleaning of ridership data, or even advanced statistical analysis to detect patterns in ridership and transit operations. And next, while we made an effort to describe some best practices around schedule creation, gleaned from our case studies, there's certainly more that can be done in this space to document best practices, especially around quality control of schedules. And then lastly, how will the scheduling industry change in the face of massive technological change coming to the entire transit agency? Will elements of the manual scheduling process be rendered obsolete by algorithms that run in the background, or even flexible service models that don't even have predetermined schedules? And then also, how will scheduling change if transit vehicles become fully autonomous, which of course is perhaps a bit down the road, but these are just a few of the questions that we as an industry will undoubtedly have to face as technology continues to change our industry as it always has. And with that, I'll turn it back to Michael to conclude.
Thank you, Peter. So that's a summary of the report, and I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge everyone who helped contribute to the report. There were several co-authors that you see listed here on the slide. The project oversight panel, which provided a lot of guidance during the research and in the construction of the report. All of our survey respondents, all 43 agencies that participated, and especially our 5 case study agencies, LANTA, RTD, OCTA, SEPTA, and DART. Just really thankful for the time and effort that they put into contributing to the report so the rest of the industry can learn about what they're doing. So with that, I'm going to pause there and turn it back to Lori. We have some time for questions.
Great. A few came in, so we'll start with the first one, which I think we're going to have to back up because it references the slide you were on at the time. But I didn't catch which slide that was. So it says, on this slide, can you define large urban systems versus others? So that was pretty early on.
It was probably in the wage discussion. So I think we defined large urban as 200,000 in population or higher in terms of the urbanized area that they were serving, if I remember correctly.
Okay, hopefully Chad H. will let us know if that did answer the question. The next question is from Sean Morrell, and he says, she, he, I'm not sure which gender Sean is, I apologize. They said, here's a long question. I was surprised to read in TCRP 143 that only 13% of transit agencies reported having union schedulers. Our schedulers at Metro Transit in Minneapolis-St. Paul are union members. We are increasingly challenged to find qualified candidates for scheduler positions from among the union ranks, given growing demand for data management and other analytical skills. Have other unionized scheduling shops addressed this challenge through formal changes in their union agreements, such as changes to hiring practices, seniority rules, job requirements, job classifications, or even the union status of the position?
So it's a very good and long question with a very long answer. We didn't look at that issue in particular. You are correct. I was looking at the numbers here. 84% of the respondents said that schedulers were not part of the union, and I think your question highlights the need, one, for just more communication among agencies about how to deal with this, but then second, the need for strong recruitment procedures. So, setting up the requirements for the job in such a way that you get highly qualified folks, whether they're coming from your union or from outside of the union. Hopefully or usually there's an opportunity that if there's nobody qualified for the position inside your union, that you're able to then recruit outside of the union, that you're not forced, to just take anyone. And if that's the case, then the key is having your recruitment procedures well defined to make sure that you are able to test and to qualify and get qualified candidates. And if there's nobody inside the union that meets the qualifications, can't pass the test, whatever, then you are able to then recruit from wherever you want. I'm not sure if that addresses your local, challenge, but I think that's ultimately the way that you might be able to address that.
Great. Peter's muted. I don't know if he muted himself or... Oh, there, he's unmuted. Okay, never mind. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in and add anything at any point, so feel free, Peter. Okay, that was the long one. The next question, also from Sean. You stated DART works with a third party to assist with major schedule changes. Does that assistance fall under the scope of an operations contract, or is it a separate contract that exclusively provides scheduling services?
Peter. I'll have to look into the exact details of that, but I believe it is the latter. It's a contract exclusively for only major service changes that happen once or twice a year. So it's exclusively around that. But I'll need to confirm that.
Okay. The next question is from David C. Did you find a pattern of represented versus non-represented schedulers?
So we kind of addressed this with the earlier response. We didn't look at the success or satisfaction with represented versus non-represented schedulers. We did find that in our respondent set, most of the schedulers were not represented, and those that were, I think were by and large were members of the Amalgamated Transit Union. But in terms of challenges or anything else that were related to union membership, we didn't really dive into that, and we didn't hear those themes coming from most of our respondents.
Okay. John Feldman asks, is it common for schedulers to have an option to work remotely at least part of their time?
Peter, do you have anything from the case studies that you picked up on?
That was not mentioned by any of the case studies, I believe, as an option. I've not heard of that.
Yeah, John, that's a really interesting question because it's come up in other offline conversations. Particularly as technology continues to support remote working or software as a service or web-based scheduling platforms, it seems like some arrangement like that would be possible to be able to work remotely. But we didn't pick up on that or ask the question. It's something that I wish I would have asked about when we did the research.
Next time.
Yeah, it's a good question.
David C. says, did any agencies report that a requirement of the scheduler job was to have been an operator?
Peter?
This is Peter again from the case study interviews that we conducted. I don't recall that being mentioned as either a minimum or preferred job qualification. Although certainly some of the agencies explicitly called for experience or knowledge of transit operations, which is a bit of a general way of getting at that same idea. And certainly at least one of the other agencies that we interviewed specifically referenced the fact that one or two of their schedulers was a recent transition from an operator, and how, of course, they thought that was a great. Obviously, there are some challenges there in terms of, at least in their experience of learning specialized software or familiarity with that, but they obviously praised that as a significant strength that particular employee brought to the scheduling department. But it was not listed as a minimum or even preferred by job qualification by any of the agencies that we interviewed.
And just to add to what Peter was saying, in the survey we did ask agencies whether they tended to hire from inside or outside, and then if they did tend to hire from inside or outside the agency, what positions they targeted or focused on. And so even though it was the agencies responded that they tend to do basically an even mix of inside and outside recruitment, the agencies that do inside, and focus on inside in terms of strategies, reported that they most commonly tried to attract operators, dispatchers, control room personnel, or other types of operations management folks to the scheduling position. Again, but like Peter said, not that it's a requirement to be in one of those positions, but you did see requirements as for an understanding of transit operations concepts, right? How does the transit system work? Or local requirements, how is the current transit system designed, right? How many bus routes are there? Where do they operate? A basic understanding of system construction was listed as a minimum requirement in several of the job in the recruitment notices that we surveyed.
Okay, and the last question for now is from Barrett. What would you say is the average size of a small transit agency that transitions from a completely manual scheduling by hand to employing any amount of specialized software, i.e. for blocking and run cutting?
Oh my goodness. You know, I don't know. It's a really good question, and I don't mean to like punt to Peter, but Peter, if you have anything you wanted to add here, we did not ask that sort of conversion question particularly, and I would struggle to find a good solid number I'd want to give you. Peter, do you have anything you want to say on that one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much else to add. I think that is an interesting question, especially as an agency is perhaps growing and the number of schedules that are needed to be created increases. When do these agencies decide to make the switch and invest heavily a lot of resources into, say, specialized software? It's not something that we looked at explicitly, and I'm sorry about that. That is a good question.
Yeah,
Okay.
either one of us could wax eloquent on and on about what we think, might be reasonable approaches, but, we don't have a good solid answer for you. I will just say one thing, because we have the opportunity to, which is, just there's going to have to be a careful weighing, right, of the challenges and costs associated with conversion to software-based schedule creation, and the potential efficiencies that might be gained. I know a lot of the scheduling software providers usually will do a rough run cut for you or a blocking for you, taking your data to try to demonstrate, hey, you could save X dollars if you, used our software. But, that's, I always question those analyses and make sure that they're being taken with a grain of salt, so to speak. So a tough decision, definitely local, and I wish I had a better a piece of information for you.
Okay, that seems to be the last question. I guess we can wait another second and see if anybody else out there starts typing. If not, any parting words? Give your contact information for any questions or anything. There it is.
Yeah. Both Peter and I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar, for NTI for hosting it, for TCRP for funding the research, and both of our contact information is up on the screen. And feel free to reach out to either one of us if you have any questions about anything today or in the report. We encourage you, of course, to download the report and read over it, and reach out to us if anything comes up you want to know more about.
That's great. Thank you. I don't see any more questions, so I guess if you have any, reach out to Michael and or Peter. Thank you to everyone for participating in this webinar. Auntie, I really appreciate your participation, and we also will appreciate your feedback because you should be getting an invitation very shortly to fill out a survey, so we always like to hear from everyone. And also a very special thank you to Michael and Peter for, oh, there's some interference, for your great presentation. It was great working with you both, and hopefully we can all meet up again in the future.
Great. I'll see people at Apta Multimodal in Boston next week, right?
Okay. Enjoy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.